My name is John, and for 7 years, something has followed me from a hunting trip I went on. So, for some background, I loved hunting ever since I was a child. At 10, I first went hunting with my father, and I've hunted all my life. As far as I can remember, I have enjoyed outdoor sports. But about 7 years ago, when I was 23, I went out on a hunting trip by myself. I was missing every shot due to where I was, fairly uneven terrain. So I went to another spot. That's when I spotted what appeared to be an altar. It was about 3 feet tall, 8 feet long. I went to investigate. The altar had blood on it. I was confused and a little worried about what I'd find around it. I looked around and saw nothing and no one. I looked for traces of any dead bodies buried nearby, and when I went back, the altar's top had been lifted off, and nothing was there. I thought it was weird, but paid very little mind to it. I left, and then, when headed back to my truck, I spotted something in the distance. It looked like a giant praying mantis, but that wasn't possible. It was black in color and was about as large as a bear, so I thought it was a black bear. I went to my truck and got in. I started the engine and left. When I made it home that night, I felt uneasy and like something was watching me. I ignored it because the doors and windows were all locked. I even made sure to check everywhere in my bedroom. For bed, my girlfriend came home that night. She had been on a vacation with her family. I welcomed her home, and she asked me with horror in her voice, "What is that?" She pointed behind me. There was nothing there. She had a history of schizophrenia. However, she always took her medication. Surely she did not forget it, did she? I played this off as a schizophrenic episode, so I told her to calm down and that nothing was there. I brought her to the bedroom and went to sleep. About 2 days later is when things really ramped up. I was at my father's home. He told me that he saw something along the tree line of his farm. I noticed it too. It was the same thing I saw prior, like a black bear. I got my rifle from my truck and aimed at it through a scope. I checked to see what it was, and the reality was more horrifying than I thought it ever could be. It had 6 legs, 2 of which were propped up similar to a praying mantis. Its body was covered in black plating, and compared to a tree, it was maybe 10 feet tall. My expression had dropped, and I was now shivering with terror. My father asked, "John!" I had remained silent. I lowered my gun and turned to him and said, "I don't know what that is," and gave him the gun. When he looked, he saw it too. Its eyes were almost piercing, like they cut your soul in two. My girlfriend came out of the house with my mother. They were chatting about something. I can't recall. I had been too shaken up. In fact, my father to this day does not remember anything about that day except that thing. It was like everything was wiped from his memory on that day. And it was fair to say, really, the way it looked was more grotesque than I can put into words. And later in the night, my father suffered a heart attack. The fear that was prior in the day overworked his heart, and it was still beating in anxiety, I'd imagine. So he had a heart attack. My mother was worried for him, and I did not tell her what I thought caused it. I never told her it, nor will I. My father was released 2 weeks later. Since then, I had been having encounters with it on my property. I even fired a few rounds at it. Contrary to what you'd think, it did nothing to it. So I began buying progressively higher power guns. On night 9, my girlfriend, we can call her Sarah, awoke and screamed. When I woke up, that thing was jumping out of our bedroom window. I got up and grabbed the rifle I keep in our room and aimed at it as it was scurrying off. Then it crossed the street into a cornfield. I could not see it to get a clear shot, so I aimed and fired once. So of course it did nothing to it. I was starting to get angry, thinking, why won't it do anything to this thing? How tough is it? I was absolutely horrified. This was the first time I had experienced true terror. I felt powerless. If this thing wanted, it could kill me at any moment. So, I prepared a trap. In my third barn, I put barbed wire at foot level and a puddle of gasoline just far enough so something would fall into it. I had a bit of gunpowder that I'd ignite and toss down, which I had hoped would kill it. Sarah's schizophrenic episodes got worse. She forgot to take her medication more often. At the time, I didn't know it was that thing boosting our anxieties. Sarah broke down one morning, even going as far as to injure herself. I had to send her to the hospital for stitches, and at this point, I was tired. And I was going to slaughter it in any way I knew how. So I lured it out and put my plan into effect. It gone off without a hitch until the end. It exited the flaming wreck that was my third barn. This thing was extremely angry now. It released some sort of sound which made me fall to my knees vomit. After I got up, I ran to my truck, got in, and started it. It pursued me while I drove away, and it was keeping pace until my truck hit 110 miles per hour. I was too busy looking in the rearview mirror to notice the turn coming up. I looked back and then turned. At 112 miles per hour, I crashed my truck. It flipped too many times for me to count. I unbuckled my seatbelt and fell down onto the roof. I crawled out, slowly blacking out. The last thing I saw was that thing doing the equivalent of laughing, like a taunt. I fell unconscious and woke up in the hospital later. I looked around, of course in a daze. A nurse said something. I could not make it out, but it was something along the lines of, "You had a pretty bad wreck, but you're okay now." I was focused on if Sarah was okay. I was clearly high on this painkiller they were giving me, so I couldn't do much. The day after I was released from the hospital, Sarah was already back home, and I went there. Sarah was in the bathroom when I arrived, showering. I walked to the living room and laid down, exhausted, more mentally than physically. When Sarah finished showering and put on new clothes, she told me to come up to our room. I did so, and she pointed out amongst the trees. That thing was watching us. Later in life, I called it the Stalker. For it stalking us, I grabbed my strongest rifle and then went outside. By the time I made it outside, it was gone. Every day since then, it had been doing the same. Until last year, around my birthday, Sarah and I were freshly married, and we had moved from Montana to Kansas to get away from it. Only 2 weeks later, it showed up, and on every third day, it began to show up. After studying it for 2 weeks, I had realized I was cursed. I began to use holy items as weapons against it, although I had no faith at the time, so it was fairly useless against it. So I went to a priest. He told me, "Give it up to God, and you will be freed." So I did that. The last time I had ever seen it, it was absolutely furious. It attacked me, pinning me to the ground and clawing at me. I had to cover my head and vital organs. It shredded up my right hand and broke my left forearm. It chewed up one of my feet as well. I'm glad I taught Sarah how to shoot, though. She shot it in the back of the head, in the place with thinnest armor. knocking it down and hitting it into a small daze. I got up and Sarah assisted me in walking away. It dove at me, but it faded into darkness. To this day, I attribute what we did to the work of God, and I am now proudly a preacher. To this day, we have not seen it again